and welcome to Deep Dive with Alvin. Today, I'm going to be speaking with the ex-nomadic scientist Bruno Sánchez-Andrade Nūno. I hope I didn't butcher that. Now, let's get right into it. Good to see you again. It's been a while.
It's been a while. What was
Right,
the last time we saw each other? Was it in Svalbard?
2018, yeah, Svalbard. Yeah, I think that was last time, yeah. Now, at the time, you were a nomadic scientist.
Yeah, I was.
And I'm sure a lot of people are wondering what exactly is that. Can you explain what it was and what it was like?
Um, I think there's more and more people that are nomadic or minimalist. There is this trend of being having been minimalist or nomading a lot. And I am a scientist, so I decided I will continue to be a scientist, but I will just travel the world. But the thing is that most people think of a scientist as a researcher, someone who's is in a lab and doing papers, scientific papers, and then writing articles and publishing those articles. But to
Yeah,
me, there is a big difference between being a scientist, which can be a researcher or could be other things. And that's who I am. It took me a long time to discover that because in university, they basically tell you that a scientist is a researcher and you go to do academia and stuff, things like that, but I discovered my own path. So when I was doing nomadic scientist, basically, I was trying to double down on that idea. How can I travel the world and then apply the scientific method, the scientific skills to help companies, to help NGOs, to help people, but also to write a book about the whole experience. And that's what I did.
yeah. So you said help companies. Now, if I'm correct, you're currently working for Microsoft
Yeah, I'm working for
and
Microsoft.
their AI for Earth
Yep,
program.
that's correct.
Yeah. Can you tell us anything about what that is and what the goal of that project is?
So on the thread of what before helping companies having NGOs, at the end of the day, a lot of the things the scientists or researchers do is the same thing, which is they use the scientific method to generate knowledge. I am using the same those skills. I don't know, like mathematical skills or absorbing complexity by breaking the complexity into steps and then trying to figure out the steps, making hypotheses, all of those things that could be done for making research, but I use it to understand society problems and then apply those. That's the thing that many researchers are not that much involved in the application of the knowledge they create. So in AI for Earth at Microsoft, it's exactly that. It's using AI, artificial intelligence in general, um, to and apply that in to do two big problems: climate change and biodiversity collapse. So basically, my job as a scientist, as the director of the planetary computer, is to figure out what are the data that anyone, scientist or non-scientist, need to understand the complexity of climate change or biodiversity collapse. What is the software, open source software, and all these things that they need to generate that knowledge, but then apply it into their own companies, into their own governments, into their own NGOs, so that we can advance in the problem. Because at the end of the day, it's not about understanding the issue; it's about solving the issue.
Yeah, and you said like mapping the problems on Earth in terms of climate change and stuff. I'm gonna assume go out on a limit and assume that you guys are using satellites
A
a lot,
lot,
right?
a lot of
Well,
satellite.
are there any like specific like did you guys build your own satellites and send them up, or are you taking already like managed information and essentially just sorting that?
So we are using mostly for now open data. So it's data that is collected by mostly two programs. One is the Landsat by NASA, and the other one is Sentinel by Copernicus by the European. And it's it has no cost. Of course, it costs a lot of money. We can talk about it to design the satellites, to launch the satellites. Most of the cost is launching the satellite and then operate the satellites. And those costs are, in the case of Sentinel, is bear by us. by our taxes. Our taxes help pay for those things. But we do not have, Microsoft does not have satellites that I know of. And we use mostly open data from constellation of satellites that are free to use. That there's no cost associated. It's not free in the sense that it costs a lot of money, but governments, in this case the European Union, rightfully sees that there is a ton of value to be generated by this data, and they invest on that, and we invest to put all that data, all the satellite data, in the right format, in the right place, so that anyone can work with it.
Yeah. And now there's a lot of talk about the second space race and billionaires going to space, but there's also a lot of talk about climate and how that will impact climate as like either worsen it or better it. How people have different views, um, but in terms of satellites, do you think there's going to be more satellites going up in do you think the billionaires are going to be using their space companies to actually help around with the gathering more knowledge and seeing what they can do in terms of that?
Yeah, yeah. That's an interesting question. By the way, sorry for the background
It's fine.
noise. I have an 8 months old baby, and it's right the time to go to bed. Um, it's a second space race, and it used putting satellites, putting anything in space used to be extremely expensive. So only governments could afford to do those things. Now we have such concentration of wealth that private individuals have the same funds to also do those things. And what happens is that when you don't respond to public funds, when you don't respond to the needs of governments, you can go much faster. So what these private companies are doing is much faster. It's also much higher risk of failure, but it's their own money. So if they want to risk and they fail, it's their own problem. If the reason they succeed, they will succeed and they will do a lot very quickly. So it's a different model. I very much believe that um, could have a lot of benefits, and but it's also extremely expensive, and we will always need the governments to invest in those resources. There is the second space race, as you say. You can the space tourism and those things. I'm not really interested in that. I think has limited value for humanity, but there is tremendous value putting putting satellites to capture images. And just as I mentioned before, public data like Sentinel and Landsat, there's also a ton of satellites from the private sector, and there's also several companies from the private sector, from very wealthy individuals who are funding companies like Planet Labs, who is basically a VC-backed company. Now it's public, but it used to be backed by all these wealthy individuals.
Yeah. And SpaceX, they have their satellite program called Starlink, which their goal
Hmm.
is to bring high-speed internet to everyone, even in like rural Africa or any other part of
Yeah,
the world, island nations
yeah.
that struggle with internet connections. Do you see that? Do you think this will be beneficial to not only the countries but just the world in general in terms of having that ability to go anywhere but still have a decent internet connection?
Definitely. Yes, I think is is a huge. So basically, I would say most of the value of satellite is either images or communications. In the case of Starlink, is communication satellites, and having having access to information, having cheap and reliable access to the internet can unlock so much value. There is so many programs by the World Bank or by international institutions or by governments to enable that any effort is laudable, especially efforts that are space, for example, Starlink, which is very expensive. It's high risk again, but if they fail, it's Elon's money. In a sense, if they succeed, it's benefits for everyone. So yeah, it's uncomfortable in a sense because you could say, hey, if it's that useful for Africa, as you were mentioning, why is not the World Bank doing that? Or why is not international institutions or governments helping doing that? And there are reasons to do that, but it's squishy. It's difficult spot to then think, are governments failing or is this too risky? Because there's so many things that could be there's so many things that could happen in technology that are not happening for several reasons.
Yeah.
Starlink was one of those, and Elon Musk came and he wants to do that, and that's fantastic.
Yeah. And there's a lot of complaint coming from um, like large scale telescopes down on Earth saying their views are being impaired by the thousands and thousands of satellites being brought up by SpaceX. Now, which one do you find more valuable in terms of like pictures going, like information being captured from telescopes down on Earth, or the communication that is being brought by Starlink?
That's a good question. I don't know. I my training is in astronomy, in astrophysics, so I'm one of those who is concerned about all the telescopes on the ground taking images up and then having those streaks of images. But to be fair, I understand SpaceX has changed the design of the satellites, but also it's changed the way they operate so to minimize these reflections
Yeah.
to Earth. It is a problem. It's a problem that we will have anyways. Not only putting satellites in space has its problems. One is that one for astronomers, but a bigger one is space debris, is when satellites collide with each other. Space is very well named, so there's a lot of space in between satellites, and it's very unlikely that two satellites collide. But if they do, it's a big problem because you have a ton of particles, and just tiny particle can trigger a cascade effect in more satellites that happen. In terms of value, it's a really interesting question. Is it more valuable if you imagine you had magically $1 million? Maybe 1 million is too little. $100 million, and you want to maximize the value to humanity. Do you invest it in communications
Yeah.
like SpaceX and with Starlink, or do you spend it in images? I don't know. Honestly, the good thing of images is that if it works in one place, it should work everywhere in the world, which is great. In terms of communications, a lot of places already have, like right now, we are not using satellites. We are
Yeah.
using landlines and ocean links, but we could unlock a lot of value. I would say short term, more value with images, um, and short term, more value for developing countries with communication.
Yeah.
Long term, hopefully, we don't depend on satellites for communication. Um, we don't. I don't know. What do you think?
That's a well, that's a fair point. Like the way I kind of look at it is, do we what do we require more? Do we require more views of the outside, like outside of our solar system, outside of our galaxy maybe? Do we require that more, or do we require communication more? In my mind,
Oh, sorry. I thought you meant value of satellites for communications or satellites for images, but you're saying value to humanity
yeah, yeah,
from Earth looking to space or from space looking to
yeah,
Earth. Okay, in that sense, clearly the short term is space looking to Earth because it's creating more wealth and then it's allowing doing more things. But um, the fundamental questions of who we are, where we come from, and all of those things, or understanding, like for example, 40 of the satellites of Starlink yesterday, they basically stopped working because there was a solar storm.
yeah,
So understanding these space weather events to minimize the impact, it's also useful. That's one of the things I was doing when I was an astrophysicist, understanding the space weather. So it is definitely important, and the more stuff we put in space, the more we have to understand, especially space weather, but also deep galaxies. And the James Webb Telescope that just left
yeah,
Earth to go to that is another example of the value of this.
yeah. Now, my final question is, what were your dreams when you were around my age? Do you have any tips to anyone in their teenage years, no matter the age, or even just in the early 20s?
I wrote a book about it. It's called Impact Science, and I'll send you the link. To it's on Amazon too, but of course I'm also giving the link to everyone to read it for free because I brought the book not to sell books, but because when I was a teenager, when I was studying, I wanted to know what I could be, and I liked science, I liked technology, I liked space. But what the society was telling me is that if you like science, your future is to be a university researcher or a teacher or things like that. And earn very low salaries. If you want money, then you need to sell your soul and do something else, or you cannot be a scientist. And I've found there is a path to do both. There is a path to be a very successful, fulfilling professional that is using the scientific method, that finds ways to use science to help society in this case, and still have a joyful life and have a family like I'm having now, and all that. And it is not easy. And my recommendation is just find your own path. Don't if you if what you want to do is normal in the sense that it's a known path, go ahead, you enjoy it. But if you don't feel comfortable with the path ahead, that's okay too. Just figure out how you can carve your own path or try to reach out to people who are doing what you think you want to do. And maybe you'll discover that you don't actually want to do it, or maybe you'll find a way to do it.
Yeah. Yeah, well, I'm definitely gonna.
Took me a long time to do that.
Yeah, that I mean that makes sense. I'm definitely gonna read that book in the near future, and I'm also gonna leave a link to it in the
It's a short
description,
one.
so that anyone who wants to can find it easily and read it. Yeah, well, thank you very much for coming on today.
Yes, well,
Uh,
all the best of luck with this experiment or this work you're doing. Thank you very much for the interest in what I'm doing. And if I can help you or anyone who's watching this video in any way, feel free to reach out and I'll do my best.